Welcome back to the Beginner Photography Podcast. Today, we're learning all about corporate event photography. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, a weekly podcast for those who believe that moments matter most and that a beautiful photo is more than just a sum of its settings. A show for those who want to do more with the gear they have to take better photos today. And now, your host, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back to this episode of the Beginner Photography Podcast. As always, I am your host, Raymond Hatfield, and I am excited for this week's interview. It is with San Francisco corporate event photographer Gustavo Fernandez. And today he shares why he left weddings to pursue corporate events and why you might want to think about it too. Spoiler alert, I sure am, to be honest, so I'm real excited for you to hear this one. But before we get into today's interview, I wanted to let you know about my brand new photography mini course, Sharpshooter Academy. If you have ever taken a photo and wished that it was sharper, Sharpshooter Academy is for you. If you've ever wanted a cheat sheet to remember what settings to use for sharp photos while you're out shooting, then Sharpshooter Academy is for you. And if you want to learn how to use your camera to its full potential to capture beautiful, sharp, crystal clear photos, then the Sharpshooter Academy is for you. Now, if you want to take sharper and more in-focus pictures, you can enroll in the Sharpshooter Academy today for just $15. Now, that is 60% off of the everyday price. And you can do that by clicking the link in the show notes. The coupon code is attached right there for you. So go ahead and check that out. I'm really interested to hear what you think about it. Now, as always, I also save a portion of the interview focused on the business of photography just for premium members who want to start making money with their camera. So this week, premium members will learn what exactly to put on your website to book every gig, how to price business-to-business shoots with different usage rights and whatnot, and just how corporate events differ, making them a better business than weddings. So if you want to learn the answers to those questions and more, become a premium member today by clicking the link on the beginnerphotographypodcast.com that says premium membership. You can do that now. With that, let's go ahead and get on into this week's interview with Gustavo Fernandez. You know, you were a pharmaceutical rep for 10 years before changing careers and then moving into photography. I'm really interested about that because, you know, what was it about photography that got you interested in the first place to start to explore it and then eventually think, oh, this is sustainable enough that maybe I can leave my career?
Right. Yeah. Great question. And first of all, Raymond, thank you for having me on. Gosh, you know, it's probably one of those, you know, that you link back to sitting in your grandma's chair and looking at all her National Geographics, right? Back when I was a little kid, and always fell in love with all that imagery and photography overall. I was, you know, I'm born and raised in the Dominican Republic. My family traveled a lot. My dad was in international business. So, you know, one of the things that after college I wanted to do is continue traveling. And what happened then was like, well, I got to start documenting this. And that's when I picked up a camera and started taking photos. And, you know, as a hobby, and then as, you know, fast forward many years and, you know, the blog started and photography and the wedding industry and WPPI, and kind of went down that rabbit hole and sort of fell in love with that community and kind of what they were creating. And that's kind of how I, you know, made the jump. I ran into Bambi Cantrel as one of the top 10 wedding photographers. You know, that first issue of American Photo that listed those top 10, opened the magazine. I was like, wait, who's this Bambi Cantrel lady? She's in Pleasant Hill. That's where I live. You know, oh, I need to sign up for her workshop. And funny enough, the assistant for that workshop was Jerry Guiones.
Oh, of course. So, yeah. Past guest of the podcast. Wow.
Exactly.
And
so
we've seen where he's been able to take his wedding business.
Exactly. And Jim Garner was also there, who's an amazing photographer out of Seattle. So I got to meet them. I got to network with them. I got to then experience WPPI and kind of, you know, build it from there. So yeah, it's been a fun journey.
So what was it? So obviously, as you said, I guess you didn't say this, but growing up, you didn't really, you know, grow up with a camera in your hand per se. It wasn't until after you got into college or after you graduated that you thought, maybe I should pick up a camera just to document what's going on here. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I was doing a lot of, hiking / mountaineering type trips, going up mountains. Like, oh, these are really cool photos. I should be capturing all these experiences. And yeah, picked up the Canon film Rebel.
Oh,
So yeah,
okay.
that was my first camera.
So you weren't looking to just take snapshots. It wasn't something you were really looking to take the best photos that you could at the time.
Exactly. Yeah. Take the
So
best photos and just capture the experience to bring it back to share with family and friends.
that's what it's all about.
Right.
In those early days, when you bought that film Rebel, essentially having to learn photography at that point, what would you say was something that maybe you struggled with most to grasp in terms of photography?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think the number one thing a lot of people struggle with is that balance, right? What is that balance? It's only those three things. It's like the ISO, the exposure, and the aperture. So it's like, how do you make that? How does that click? And it took quite a while. And I did take some classes. I took some beginner classes, like local camera clubs, joined a couple of those, and just practice until it clicked in my mind. Is like, oh, that's how you balance all these three numbers. And literally, like, after you figure that out, like, everything is just, a lot easier from there. But I would say that was one of the number one challenges, was figuring out, how do I get what I have in my mind, to show up on the camera, especially when it's film.
Yeah, of course. And you have that long delay between the time where you press the shutter and you actually see the photo. Was there actually like a moment that it all clicked, or was it in? I'm always interested in this because oftentimes, you hear of those who think like, oh no, this literally just clicked. I literally just figured out how this works right now. And then there's others who, looking back, is when they realize, oh, actually, I kind of do know this whole photography thing. Was it like that for you?
Yeah, there's an exercise that our teacher did, and I think it's a very standard exercise, where you take a photo of a white piece of paper and you underexpose it, straight on expose it, and then overexpose it. And then you do the same thing with a black piece of paper or a gray piece of paper, or even just a piece of concrete. And then you look at those images. You have to develop those back in the day, but now you can do that in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it clicked. It's like, oh, this is what the camera is trying to do. So then you learn what the camera is doing, and then you can correct for the camera. So that simple step of taking a photo of a white piece of paper, underexposing, exposing it correctly, and then overexposing it, and then doing it same with the dark, is I think it's eye-opening. That helps you figure out what's behind the camera and what the camera's thinking, so you can overcompensate for it.
Of course, of course. So you took that course with Bambi Cantrel. You learned wedding photography from her. What was that next step for you before you left the pharmaceutical rep world?
Sure. Next step. Gosh, great question. Got a job, started looking at opportunities, like where could I learn the most. Of course, I started assisting her, which was an immense opportunity. She drugged me, per se, she's like, you have to go to WPPI, you have to kind of come learn from the best. So, that was definitely my number one kind of eye-opening experiences, when you see people from all over the world, teaching, and you're learning from them, and you see these people that are actually doing this full time. It's like, oh wow, this is a possibility. And then actually, who was it? It was Jose Villa and Joe Busick. They were doing a on the road series with I think it was a Photo Plus or one of those groups, and I got to sit in with them and just 10 other people in a room and just be inspired by their journey. But what were the next steps is just continuing my education, continuing to build my network, continuing to help others out, to figure out like how can I be a resource. I ended up volunteering at WPPI at print competition, which Bambi was very involved with. And I got to meet, most of the speakers that way, which was a great experience, and got to learn what does great imagery look like, and got to listen to them for 2 days, going over, some of these masterful images and why they're great images, why they're not great images, and learn from the behind the scenes. After that, it was, getting a job within the industry. So I worked for a studio manager a commercial studio photographer in San Francisco. So learning the ropes from him, learning to kind of deal with clients, because that's an even different world, right?
Oh yeah.
That's a lot of managing the client, teaching the client expectations, hiring models, to kind of the gamut. So there's tons to learn that way. So just slowly educating myself, working with others, second shooting for Bambi. Actually, I ended up second shooting with a gal for many years after that. So trying to find opportunities to just, help and at the same time learn from other people.
So, having done this for a few years, going to weddings, knowing what it's like shooting, learning from some of the best, going to these conferences that are specifically geared around weddings, like WPPI, when did corporate events for you come on the radar, and what was it about them that interested you?
Sure. Yeah. So, basically I started with weddings and portraits, which, is kind of like that WPPI world, sort of you kind of get initialized into per se. And I guess that was my journey. And how I got introduced to the corporate event world was, given I come back from a corporate environment, I was doing a lot of work for different hotels and I was being added to different preferred vendor lists. Preferred vendor list is when a hotel or a venue adds you to a list of recommended vendors that, for example, a client comes in and is like, hey, we need a photographer. Who do you recommend? They'll have two or three on that list. So I was fortunate enough to get on some of these lists. And one of my main hotels, which was the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, had added me to their list. And they kept asking me specifically, like, hey, we got this corporate thing. Would you be able to do this also? And I think the reason was, I got added to the, one, being a professional, showing up on time, being helpful to the hotel, being a resource, kind of helping them out with photos or headshots of their team, and just being there and just, being an ally per se, or somebody that, they can call for help. I think when you look at the corporate business, like what does a corporate event planner need? Somebody who's going to show up on time, somebody who's going to be well dressed and going to be able to talk to my attendee, somebody who's going to be, sort of incognito and not, disturb the whole meeting, and somebody that I can communicate easily with. So, given I guess I already had a lot of those traits because I came from a business background in sales specifically, and I'm able to hang out with the CEO of the company or just his admin, easy enough. So I think they kind of saw that in me as like, oh, here's somebody that we can refer without an issue, and our clients are going to love him.
So when was it that you thought you did that first gig, say, you went to it, you shot it? Did you immediately think to yourself, oh, I'm done with weddings and I'm going all in on these corporate events?
Not at all. I mean, it took me quite a while, and I think it's only been 2-3 years that I've it's probably a little longer now, that I've pretty much sort of strictly been, corporate events and headshots. But, it took a while for me to click. I'm not saying I don't love the weddings. Weddings are just a different beast. For a wedding, it's interesting. It started to click slowly when I realized, like, wait a second, every year I need to find 30 to 40 new clients, depends on what type of business you're running. Every year you got to make sure that all your preferred vendors are happy, that you're delivering images to them. Every year you got to make sure you're taking care of those independent wedding planners, which we all want to get those high-end weddings. So you have to kind of, schmooze with them, send them gifts and whatnot. You have to be published. You got to get on the right blogs. You got to get in the right magazines. It just never ends. You have to go out, be networked, be seen, not to be forgotten. So I noticed that the wedding industry is extremely heavy on the marketing side, and how much you have to put out to get those, 30 to 40 weddings. Whereas a corporate event, I quickly figured out, it's like, wait a second. Once they have your name, once they love your work, they're just going to call you every year when they come back to town, or for every job they do every month. And once that clicked, I was like, wait a second, I got to double down on this. Like, why? First of all, it's a recurring business model. I don't have to go find 30 to 40 new clients every year. I can keep my JP Morgan every year, who I shoot 3 to 4 to 5 events a year. I can shoot those 5 to 10 events for Forbes every year. Like, they're not going to call anybody else. They're not seeking, some other photographer to change it up. For them, it's business, right? It's like, boom, we got the lighting, we got the photographer we always use, like next. I recently got an inquiry the other day, which kind of reminded me of the beauty of this sort of a business model. And what it was like, hey, our photographer just retired. We need our new photographer. I was like, perfect.
Score.
Now I'll be doing those events and those headshots for them until I retire, per se. So, and that's kind of the thought process. Like, you do a great job, you keep them happy, and they're just going to keep calling you every year. And then you can count on that business yearly, instead of having to kill yourself with all the marketing and whatnot.
Yeah, of course. So I'm interested in the fact that, when you shoot a wedding and you have that experience shooting weddings, there's really only two people who you need to, focus on at a wedding, and you already know kind of all the events that are going to happen. With corporate events, what is it that you're expected to deliver, and who specifically is your client? Is the CEO of JP Morgan calling you up?
Right. Great question. To start off with, who is the client? The client is typically either the director of events for that company, or the director of marketing, or a lot of times it could be the CEO's chief of staff. So that's actually one of the challenges, depending on the size of the company too, is one of the challenges of finding who is that person that's actually running the event. For JP Morgan, it's the director of events for JP Morgan. So she is, sits atop of a whole team. She has about, I want to say 10 to 15 people under her that run different events around the globe. Wow. For her. So she was one of the first ones that reached out, because she came to a small venue that I'm on the preferred vendor list for, where she was running a small event for the CEO. And I was on that list, and I got called up, and she was there. So, but for example, if you look at Forbes, who's running the events, again, they have a team of about 10 people that run different events for the magazine that they're doing kind of all over the world also. The Forbes 30 Under 30, the Forbes Ag Tech Summit, the Forbes CIO Summit. So, and then you have, for example, some holiday parties that I do a lot of at the end of the year. And that's a lot of times it's depending on the company. So San Francisco, a lot of tech companies. So for example, the admin of that CEO is the one calling me up, because she's the one in charge of like, okay, I'm going to get the venue, I'm going to do this. A lot of times she'll hire an event planner, or she'll hire a catering company that has event planning services attached to it. And then that catering company might reach out to me, or she might, and I'll be referred that way. So it's a challenge figuring that person out. Most of the time it's that director of marketing, or that director of events, or that admin for the CEO, or that chief of staff.
When it comes to these big companies that have these titles, as you said, this woman had 15 people under her whose job it is to plan these events. Why do you think, now you might not have the answer to this, I don't know, but why do you think that these companies don't just have an in-house photographer who travels with them to these events, and instead they hire locally?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's a challenge to have an in-house photographer because they're going so many places. For example, I was flying around. It's probably cheaper for them to fly me around than to have somebody full-time staff, because think about, what does full-time staff mean? Full-time staff means you got to pay for healthcare, you got to pay for all their trips and travel and whatnot. And your salary, that's a salary, that's a full year salary. Versus think about it, if I'm only doing, if they're only doing 5 events a year around the globe, that's only 5 times they're flying me around. It's way cheaper than having a full-time photographer on staff. There are companies that do have a full-time photographer on staff. For example, Liberty Mutual, who I've done a few events for, they have a full-time photographer, but in Boston at their main home office. So he's the person that'll do a lot of the headshots. He's the person to do a lot of the local events, or maybe some regional events. But when it comes to a little bit of travel, that's when they'll reach out to other vendors.
I gotcha. That makes sense. It all just comes down to money. All just comes down to money.
Exactly.
So in your own words, what would you say is the job description for a corporate event photographer? What are you expected as far as the photos to deliver?
Sure. That's a great question, because, I think wedding photography was one of the best trainings for that. Why? Because, it's sort of We have to bring in, as wedding photographers, we always want to get published. We always want to be featured in different magazines or publications or whatnot. So we're always taking photos of everything, right? Like taking photos of the flowers, takes over to the table setups for the venue, takes photos of the lighting for the lighting person or for the lighting tech, takes photos of the desserts for that dessert person or the cake person. So the weddings was a great training because it trained me to make sure that you're capturing all the different details of the event. And that's still exactly what I do. I come into, sure, it's a lot more simple setup, a little more boring per se, right? Most of the time it's just a, very nice, well set up stage with very nice lighting. So that makes it super easy. But then the challenge is like, okay, how can I, deliver images of different angles, different setups, looking at their websites, like how are they using these images, making sure that you're educated before you even show up to the event and talking to the clients, like, hey, how are you going to be using these images? Do you need a specific, do you like more horizontal? Do you like more verticals? Like, oh no, we like all verticals because we use them in this magazine per se. So that's definitely, having that conversation beforehand. But typically, nowadays I just have a shot list in my mind, right? It's like, cool, I got the big wide setup of the whole venue of what it all looks like before they all walk in. I got some tight shots of the stage. I have some nice tight shots of the podium. For me, why am I doing this? And it's what everybody should be thinking about is, if I was that event planner and I'm bringing a brand new team to build this event next year, and I'm going to go to a different hotel and set this up, or a different venue, what would I like to have in my packet? And it's like, oh, hey, where's that shot of the podium? Where's that shot of the stage? How was that set up? How did we set up the dessert station? How did we set up that break? Where did we set that up? Where did Gustavo do that headshot station? Okay, perfect. We need this much space for that. So it's like, providing that imagery that can help your client out in the long run for the future. So I think I over deliver a little bit when I take random images. When you think as a photographer, it's like, oh, why'd you take photos of those couches in that corner? It's like, well, that's their meeting setup. That's their charging station for their cell phones. That's the things that they're providing to make sure that all the attendees are happy. So typically what I deliver is a little bit of everything. Mostly, of course, maybe 10% of the images are just different scene setters showing up, what they did to set up for the whole crowd. A lot of their branding, because branding might change over the years. They want to have the historical, representation of that. So you got to make sure to capture that. And then of course, stage. So there's a lot of people typically speaking on stage. So it's a lot of different angles of that imagery, from the close-ups to from the background, through showing that there's an audience to that speaker. But then also the breaks, showing the engagement between the different attendees, showing them interacting, showing them having a good time, showing them smiling. So it's all encompassing, just like a wedding. It's just, but it's just a little bit different flow.
When it comes to, I'm interested with how many photos you're explaining that you're taking. There's a lot there. And I know that at a wedding, as you said, you still try to capture a lot of those things, the details, the right. events that are going on. But I know for a wedding, there can be a lot of culling that happens after the fact. Are you doing a lot of culling after shooting an event, or are they expecting photos right away and you don't have time for that?
It depends. For the photos right away, there's different clients have different needs. To answer your first question on the culling, I delete about 60% of the images 60% from an event. And for example, if I'm taking one shot, I'm taking 3 to 4 to 5 of that same shot. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that just because of focus, mainly making sure number one, I'm getting it in focus. Number two, I'm getting a great expression from that speaker, or from that interaction of two people speaking, right? Two people speaking, I'll probably take a minimum of 3 to 5 photos. And I'm just kind of sitting there like looking around, looking through my viewfinder, which is what I try to teach a lot of my shooters, is making sure you're always looking around your viewfinder. It's like, oh, is there an exit sign in that corner? Is there something distracting over here? Is there somebody that's going to be coming in my field of vision and, getting into my photo, and just creating that photo versus just trying to just, provide a candid photo. That's one of the things I tell my shooters is like, hey, slow down and create the image instead of, just taking a random candid. So I'm delivering, basically I delete about 60 to 70% of the images because of that, because I'm taking 3 to 5 photos of every shot that I want to deliver. And what does that client expect? It all depends. Sometimes it's like, hey, we need social media imagery, an hour after the event. We need 10 to 15 photos to throw on Facebook or on Instagram or whatnot, or on Twitter. A lot of times, for example, for JP Morgan does that for me. And what does that look like? That typically looks like me grabbing my laptop at the end of that keynote session that happened with the important speaker, just a quick download, and throwing off 15 images on a thumb drive. It's like, hey, here's a director of PR. I hand it over to her. She takes care of it. 2, a little bit of an added service where we bring an in-house speaker, an in-house editor.
That'd be quite a service right there.
We do a job for Bank of America where we bring an in-house editor, where on the hour or after every session, I'm walking over and handing my memory card to my editor. And he's actually in a room with the team, 2 or 3 PR gals and, a couple of the marketing people. And they'll go over and look at all the images on his laptop and be like, we want that one, and that one. And as they go, they'll be publishing those images to Twitter and to the different social networks.
That's
promoting
incredible.
the event. Yeah.
That sounds very high stress.
It's not bad because you just have to hand it over.
Right. Yeah.
Let my editor stress out.
So if you are if you're not delivering, 60 to 70% of the photos that you take, say, I don't know, how long is a typical corporate event and how many photos would you say that you deliver?
Gosh, that's a great question. Typical, it all depends. They're all different, right? It could be a 1-hour NASDAQ closing bell ceremony, which I'll deliver actually probably 200 to 300 images, which is actually quite a bit for an hour. But I guess I can walk through that. If you walk through the event, what is that event, right? There's 2 or 3 people that are introducing the main speaker. Then there's the main speaker, and then there's sort of the ceremony. So there's a lot going on within a closing bell ceremony. A lot of events are those 2-hour networking, kind of an alumni event in the evenings. I'll deliver, I don't know, it always varies. So it's hard to say. But I definitely tend to over deliver than under deliver. So I definitely want to have them have more images than less. What I think in my frequently asked questions, it says 50 to 100 images an hour, something like that.
Okay, pretty standard.
Yeah, pretty standard. And, but it's funny because when I'm shooting and I'm thinking that I don't have that many images because this event maybe for some reason doesn't have that much going on, I'm always in my back of my mind thinking, when the client asks like, hey, are these all the images? Like, yeah, if you look at 100 images in an hour event, like it's like more than 1 photo a minute. Yeah. They're like, oh, okay, never mind. So it's always sort of in my back of my mind. It's like, I got to get a few more images and trying to create something.
The internet has ruined people's perception on how many photos is enough, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges I have is definitely culling down, and especially for those 2 or 3 day events. I would do these 2 or 3 summit type days events for Forbes, and they're like, hey, we just want like 5 to 10 minute images of each. I'm like,
I got 1,000.
Oh my gosh. I was like, I have like 300 of this 1-hour session, just making sure I'm getting all the great angles and what's like, how do you want me to call this down to 10 photos to finally deliver? So that's my biggest challenge is, of course, is deleting all the good stuff.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things you don't know if they're going to want it, portrait or landscape. Exactly. So you just got to deliver as much as possible. So, exactly. But when it comes to pricing this for B2B, business to business, right?
Right.
My head, it starts to hurt. This is where it gets crazy. You look online, people are charging usage rights and image sizes and delivery times, and it's just a whole list of add-ons. It seems that you have no idea how to charge for these things. So for you, what does the pricing structure for corporate events look like?
You are listening to the free version of the Beginner Photography Podcast, where each week you learn how world-class photographers see and capture the world around them. If you want to hear the extended interview with their best business tips to learn how to make money with your camera, then become a premium member today by heading over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and click the premium membership button to join now.
I hadn't thought of that many, ideas as to why corporate events is such a better business. When you think about it on paper compared to weddings, or corporate events is a better business than weddings. As you said, you really get wrapped up in the idea of like, oh, we're gonna have so much fun at your wedding, and this is like the happiest day of these people's life, and it really becomes personal, it becomes emotional. But when you break it down from a business standpoint, and those 3 tips that you shared it makes me rethink. Wait, why am I shooting weddings? All of that sounds fantastic. So thank you for sharing those. Thank you for sharing those.
I mean, the other thing about the weddings, people get excited about the sexiness of that. Ooh, I want to build and I don't even know where the high end numbers are, right? Like that $10,000 wedding, right?
Yeah.
Like, but people forget, and they need to start thinking about is how much time are you actually putting in?
A ton.
From that first initial email consultation to that 1 hour meeting or 2 hour meeting with those clients to potentially hire you, to then the engagement session, that's 2 or 3 hours, to then the day of the wedding, 10 plus hours driving back and forth and whatnot. At the end of the day, you're looking at 30 to 40 hours, divide that time, 10,000 by that. Like, what are you actually making?
Take out expenses.
Taxes, take out expenses. Like, what are you actually making per hour? It sounds like very lucrative and exciting, but at the same time, you need to kind of boil it down and be like, wait a second, what is this really going to take?
Yeah.
And then think about all the marketing expenses you're already doing and whatnot, and all the marketing post that wedding that you have, all the hours you have to spend after you're actually done with the client, then all the hours you're spending with pulling out all the cake photos, pulling out all the vendor photos, all that stuff. But yeah.
So, and again, that's what makes sense. I think, we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about our time and how much it's worth to us. So again, thank you for sharing that. Part of the whole reoccurring revenue, which is really exciting, is we all know that photography is a service more than it is a commodity, right? It's not a commodity, it's a service. We're serving somebody, and whether it be a couple at a wedding or a large publicly traded company in the case here with corporate events, it's a service. And part of a service, or part of being a good service provider, is over delivering. So how or who do you try to over deliver to when working with large publicly traded companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I look at it, it's a lot of times you don't even have to over deliver in the photography, right? How can you deliver as a person? How can you deliver as that service provider, right? I'll bring up a couple examples with HPE, Hewlett Packard Enterprises, is one of my clients, and they hire me every year to come in to do a week-long, it's actually 2.5 day or 3 day event for their executives. And it's like 100 or almost 200 of their top executives from around the world.
Wow.
And I do almost 200 headshots plus cover the 2.5 day event plus all the evening. It's madness. Aside from me delivering and giving them a great product and a great experience for each of those people that I do the headshots for, it's those little things, right? My client's like, hey, we have these gifts. These are the little raffle items that we do during the random breaks and whatnot. Here's 20 items. Like, hey, can you take photos of each of these and send them to me so we can put them on the slide? I was like, of course, not a problem. I went a step further and fixed it. It's like, you know what? Wait, I don't have to take a photo. All I have to do is look up the name and pull the photo from online. So now for the last 2 years, I was like, hey, do you need me to take care of this again? And I'm not charging them extra. They're already paying for my time to be there. How can you make their life easier? How can you assist them, right? So I sit down, I spend half an hour. I literally, it's like a tray of all these cool things, like the iPad, like the different, the AirPods and whatnot. Just takes me 30 minutes, pull it up, drag the file, put it in a Dropbox and send her the photo. It's like, it's one of those things that like, okay, done. I don't have to deal with that. A lot of times it's like, oh, there's a napkin on the floor in the middle of the hallway. Like people are going to be walking out here in 5, just picking up that napkin, taking care of of things that are not per se your, a lot of people will just walk by and not care, right? Like, I want to be, like part of the team. How can you be part of that team? How can you make things flow? Half the time people asking me, it's like, hey, where's the restroom? It's like, oh my gosh, here. It's like right over here. It's like, hey, what's the Wi-Fi? It's like, oh my gosh, here's the, or I see people kind of like with those questions, and I'll overhear and I'll step in. It's like, hey, just walk down this way and whatnot. How can you be part of that team? How can you kind of go above and beyond and be helpful instead of just kind of sticking in the background and just sort of, being out of the way per se, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just being part of the team. That's like my number one piece of advice is like thinking how they're thinking, right? It's like, how can you help them a little bit better? How can you, hey, next year, here's what I would like, hey, would you, suggest, I would suggest is like, oh, great idea. Or letting, hey, a lot of times, like even just helping like other vendors out. It's like, hey, we're missing a place setting here. We're in a room of 200 plus place settings. Like, oh, they missed one. It's like, you go walk up to the server, but like, hey guys, you missed a place setting here. Or to the lighting people, it's like, hey, the lighting's a little off to the left on that right couch. Do you mind? It's like, oh, thank you. And I'll show them on the camera. That way they look good. So how can you help everybody else at that venue, at that event look good? I think that's, you're always going to win.
For sure. What about, again, going for like the service-based business, one thing that I do for wedding couples is that once I book them, I send them like a little care package, a little gift package. So it has some trail mix, it has just like some fun outdoor stuff to kind of promote that adventure that I try to push with my wedding photography.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you do in terms of gifting that helps kind of a corporate? Let me kind of rephrase this, which is like when you think of gifting, the corporate world, there's lots of it. Do you do any gifting that stands out, that makes sure that your name is at the top of the list rather than just popcorn or some chocolate or something?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. I don't do anything the same repetitively. So for you or for a lot of wedding photographers, that makes sense. It's part of your workflow. Here's my little typical gift basket that I send to my 30 to 40 clients every year. It's like chunk, 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 like clockwork. Like that's my touch point. For me, those corporate events are a little bit different, right? Because they're calling me every year. So I can't be like first time, okay, send them the basket. Second time, what do I send them? So I try to take it a little bit different and just build upon that relationship. So for example, like, oh, my event planner is having a baby. So, connected them in that level. It's like, how can I send them a gift that is super unique, that they're never, one of my key tenets to a gift is, how can I gift them something that they're never going to throw away? So that's, and one of my event planner friends gave me the best idea and for people that are having babies. And that idea was, it's a custom stool. I think it's called a stool. It's one of those step stools for kids to step up to kind of brush their teeth.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Over at the sink. And what's cool about this stool, it's less than $100, but it's this cool, colorful stool, and it has their name engraved in block letters. Oh. And the block letters come out. So it's super unique.
You're not throwing that away.
So it's like, it's like, oh, cool. It's got Raymond on there. Like you can pull the R out, pull the A out, before they can even stand on the stool, they can already be playing with it. So it's like, how can you create that gift? So for me, given that my clients are long-term clients, right? They're calling me every year. So I just try to keep up to date with what's going on in their lives, checking in via text or checking in via Facebook, as many of us do, and making sure that we're seeing when their birthdays are and whatnot. I mean, it's, from a simple thank you note, as we all forget about, a handwritten thank you note, to, a very unique gift like that. You don't have to be doing that every year. Mm-hmm. It could be every couple of years. So that's kind of the beauty of building some of these relationships, is you're going to have them for the long term. So it's not like I need to be sending them gifts every 3 months per se. But again, it's just finding something fun, finding something unique. For example, one of the directors of marketing for a tech company, come to find out he was half Dominican. I'm, born and raised in the Dominican Republic. So he has a little boy, And I was back home in the DR, and I thought of it and was like, oh, it'd be cool if I brought back, first of all, some Dominican coffee, which is the best. And then second of all, I was like, oh, what could I bring for his son? That so he could try like some Dominican treats. And it's like, those little kind of very sweet things that you eat as a kid, wherever you're from, you always remember that. And so I picked up a few dollars worth of those Dominican, very sugary treats.
Yes.
And sent that to him, with some of that coffee. It's like, hey, some thoughts from home, hope you enjoy this, and your boy can kind of get a taste of where you come from and whatnot. So it could be as simple as that. Literally, that cost me $10. So, but that turned into a $10,000 client, because a few months later, he calls up like, hey, you know what? I'm having a meeting and I need the meeting photographed and I need 100 headshots. Like, let's talk. So for me, at the end of the day, it's just keeping it personal. Mm-hmm. And then number one, and then number two, just being top of mind, checking in with them once in a while, from a simple text to just, one of the things I love these days is just doing like a video email. You go to loom.com or many other service providers out there and just do a quick, it's like, hey, Raymond, checking in with you, man. Hope you're doing well. I thought about you. I read this article. I wanted to also send it to you. So I'll send a lot of articles a lot of times. I'll send a random text with a photo with like one of the fun ones. It's like, oh, I'm here with mom. So they get to connect. It's like, oh, here's a guy who's got a family. Here's what we're supporting. And just, for me, it's just keeping it personal and continuing to build that relationship, and then keeping tabs of what they're up to via Facebook or Twitter, or what the best place might be for them.
That's great. I mean, again, you've really boiled it down to I hate to say a system, because it's not a system, but it's a way of doing business that is personal to who it is that you're working with. And I'm sure that in the world of, Fortune 500 companies and again, publicly traded organizations, there's probably not a lot of that. So I could see how you would stand out with your photography and your service. So that is such a great tip.
Bringing the human to corporate.
Bringing the human to corporate.
Because it's all about humans, right? It's all about people. So you see these behemoth Fortune 500 companies, but there's always a human behind that's pulling the trigger, per se, right? There's always that one person that is that you need to connect with. So that's where I'm still at with what I did with weddings, build that relationship. And that's the same thing I do. It's just build that relationship with them.
Well, now that you need to update your website and put that little blurb under there, bringing the human to corporate. I'm not going to charge you for that, by the way. That's all yours. You can have that. I had one question earlier that I did not ask you that I really do want to get back to, and that is, when you are shooting weddings, there's a lot of opportunity to be creative with your imagery, to do something new and unique, either with lighting or, a focal length, and just create something that most people can't see unless they're a photographer. How much room is there for creativity in the corporate event space?
Gosh, typically not that much. There's maybe, I guess, not even 10% of my images. There might be a handful of images every event, right? That I might get, I was like, oh, then maybe this cool angle, or shoot this in between people's heads from the audience and whatnot. There is very limited amount of that. And if you think about it, if you look at, for example, corporate brochures, or if you look at annual reports and whatnot, I'm shooting for JP Morgan, or I'm shooting for HPE, or what do they want to project? If this is an image that I took and they put it on the website, would this be an image that they would feature on the website? Yes or no? So a lot of times, yes, it's going to be a lot more businessy. It's going to be a lot more, at the same time, that's a challenge, right? Because you still have to, how do you deliver something that doesn't have that exit sign back there, doesn't have a distracting element back there, is a great composition and whatnot. So I think you're still being creative, because you're still thinking about all those things, right? And at the same time, it's like, how can I bring in something different than my last event? But to be honest, I'd say, gosh, 60-70% of the time, it's always the same, but different venues provide different lighting capabilities and unique spots. So that's where you can kind of challenge yourself in a way. Or, hey, this is what I typically deliver 80% of the time. I can play for the rest of the time, that 20%. I can kind of get crazy. I can bring out that 1.2 millimeter lens and play with that. So that's one of the things I learned quickly back in my wedding days when I hired a second shooter, that I didn't realize was one of those shallow depth of field shooters, right? And it didn't necessarily match my profile. So when I came together in the album, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a big challenge, because her images were shooting through the window or the glass and whatnot, right? And super, super creative, where for me, I'm more of a kind of a classic, more timeless, standard is a terrible word, look, right? When her super creative images came together, it's like that didn't really match up. So yes, it's definitely, as Paul Jarvis says, I forget the name of the book he wrote, but it's I'm running a boring company, but there's nothing wrong with boring.
Yeah.
And I'll send you the article. I'll send you a link to that article. And it's like, it's a company that, it's a business that provides that revenue and is repeatable, and it's, it's not that complicated. So, but if it's somebody that like, oh my God, I need to be super creative and creating these outward designs or these cool shots, like, yeah, maybe weddings is definitely the place you got to be, because that's where you have that flexibility. That's where you have that time. That's where you own the subject, right? For us in the corporate, we don't own the subject. We can't touch that subject because they're on a schedule and we're just trying to keep up and create as they go. So, yeah.
And I can say from personal experience, sometimes being forced to be creative at a wedding can kind of drain you a whole lot faster than when you are, trying to get the shots that you need, getting the shots that that the clients are going to like, and then still being able to, come home and do something fun and interesting with your kids, or just do that creative, aspect of photography on your own time. But if you got a business that's making money, then there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because I'll do one wedding maybe every other year or so. And I just got a recent inquiry from a planner who I've done several corporate events for. It's like, hey, would you do this? I'm like, tell me more. It's like, oh, they're, in their 50s plus and second wedding. I'm like, yes, that's my client. Why? Because it's going to be easy. They're not going to bug you about it. They're just going to be like, show up and take some nice photos of us and their friends. And it's all going to be classic and simple looks and standard, posing and whatnot. It's like, of course I'll be there.
Yeah.
So it's funny how I whatever the word is, right? Transpose that into the corporate is, I'll put that into the wedding work that I still do.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, a simple, wedding at City Hall in San Francisco for a friend. Heck yeah.
Done.
Because it meets all these criteria.
Absolutely. That is so great. Gustavo, I have to say thank you for your time today, because I know that you shared so much and we've gone over the time that we had talked about already. So again, super gracious with your time, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. But before I let you go, first of all, is there anything that maybe I didn't ask you that you want to make sure that people understand about corporate event photography? And then lastly, if anybody's interested, where can they find you online?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been super fun. We've gone all sorts of places where I hadn't gone before. And gosh, I think we covered it all. At the end of the day, it's like, find that niche that you love, try all the different niches, try all the different, like I mentioned, the baby, photographing the event, photographing the family, photographing a corporate thing, photographing a wedding, and just giving everything a shot. And photographing that watch or doing product photography, just trying everything at least once to kind of get that experience to see, why do I love this? Why do I not love this? And I think that's kind of the best place to start. And then find some of those thought leaders and learn from them, and how can you be a resource to them, and go from there. But where to find me? Simply GustavoFernandez.com. That's the easiest way. And I'll send you a link to one of the, have a little PDF of the top 10 things to do to start off with your corporate event business, as a resource, and we'll go from there.
Perfect. I will, of course, put that in the show notes for listeners to find. And again, Gustavo, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to keeping up with you in the future.
Same here, Raymond. Appreciate it. Thanks again.
I sure hope that changed a lot of people's opinions on the business of photography. It is so easy to get stuck thinking, oh, well, if you want to make a lot of money, you have to shoot weddings. And that's simply not the case here. My biggest takeaway from this episode was just to take a step back and look at your business and decide if that's really what you want to do. With weddings, there is a ton of marketing that is involved. It's nonstop. You're always looking for new clients. Corporate events, it sounds like Gustavo has found a great option that works for him. And even if it's not, quote unquote sexy, it makes money. And that frees you up mentally from having to perform creative camera magic at every event that honestly can become a trap that you're known for, Think about actors who become known for that one role that they can never break out of. They can't do anything else after that. So, I don't know, man. Honestly, as my kids get older, it would be nice to not have to work every weekend. But I would love to hear your biggest takeaway from this episode with Gustavo, and I would love for you to share it in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. I'd love to hear it. So that is it for this week. Until next week, I want you to make do. I want you to make more. I want you to do more. And I want you to make do with what you got, because I promise you, it's better than you think. All right, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.